As oil prices rise, the government this week put more emphasis on renewable energy. So why did it cancel Britain's plans to get energy from the sea? Why is wave power dead in the water? The power of the waves, dangerous, destructive, a threat to man. But those same waves could supply Britain with a quarter of all its electricity. In a week that's seen petrol prices rise again and the government discover a new interest in renewable energy, the question is, can we do without wave power? Tonight, This Week reports how scientists and engineers like Professor Stephen Salter suddenly found their promising research programme on wave energy cancelled. 8 years later, the government is now being pressed to explain that decision. The House of Commons Energy Committee has already heard evidence from Professor Salter that facts and figures were deliberately distorted to make wave power look unpromising and justify cutting off funding. What the committee now wants to know is, why was wave power sunk before a single device had been built and tested at sea?
How anyone can cancel a development program of this type before one machine had been properly evaluated or the economics worked out, I just do not know. It is inconceivable to think that a program will be cancelled before a prototype has been tried, but that is what appears to have been done on this particular occasion.
As a result of the government's decision to cut off the cash to the wave energy researchers, large-scale offshore wave power is today dead in the water. And Professor Salter is crying foul.
I really can't help feeling that there was a conspiracy between a small number of people involved to change the information that was passed on to the politicians so that the decisions were distorted.
If Professor Salter's allegations are true, then, as the Commons Energy Committee says, millions of pounds of our taxpayers' money have been wrongly diverted away from wave energy, away from a technology that seems ideally suited to our island nation, surrounded by the sea.
Right, now the crucial test is to watch the recovery from capsize.
Models of the duck were developed by Stephen Salter at Edinburgh University. The Department of Energy had told the different research teams to design the equivalent of a very large power station. The ducks would have been huge, like all the wave devices, each one 38 metres long, and lots of them would have been needed.
The plan for the big power station was to have a long necklace of them, a whole string of them. Each of them would be mounted on a section of spine like that and be rotating round it.
Everyone seems to agree that in principle the duck was the most efficient of all the different wave devices. But there were doubts about whether such a complex design would work. The duck's up and down movement would be transferred through gyroscopes, oil pumps and motors to electricity generators, all sealed up in a near vacuum inside huge watertight cylinders. It was the technology of the future. Despite the inventiveness of Stephen Salter and his team, some thought the duck would never operate reliably.
But they would react like that to any piece of modern technology. If you showed the inside of a gas turbine engine to someone who'd only seen steam engines, or the inside of a modern camera to someone who'd only seen the Victorian mahogany boxes, every bit of successful modern technology looks incredibly complicated and advanced to the engineers of the previous generation.
The government's investment in wave power research rose rapidly, from less than £1 million a year to nearly £4 million in 1982. And as a result of this effort, the estimated price of the electricity wave power would produce came down. In 1977, it would have cost up to 56p to keep a 1-bar electric fire going for an hour. By 1982, some wave power devices looked as if they might do it for 5. Then, in March that year, research was abruptly halted. Ministers were advised,
no new development work on wave power should be supported.
In university and industry laboratories, the waves subsided. Wave power research was becalmed. Like many of his colleagues, Stephen Salter was baffled by what had happened.
I was astonished. I really was very surprised, because just before the decision to shut it, the official consultants had released a report which was really very favourable. It was full of phrases like, the concept is hard to fault.
Why did it happen?
I'm still trying to find out why it happened, and the suspicious conspiracy theory would be that people were suddenly alarmed that they might actually have to go ahead and build this thing if the trend in cost reductions continued.
But who were these people? What kind of people wanted to stop you, do you think?
Well, the most obvious candidate would be the nuclear industry, and they were in a very good position to influence events because they were in control of the whole programme.
It was at Harwell, the nuclear heartland, that research into renewable energy, like wave power, was based. Though ETSU, the Energy Technology Support Unit, reported to the Minister rather than the Atomic Energy Authority, it was surrounded and often staffed by men whose background was essentially nuclear.
There were people in the senior management, at times, in Harwell, who always looked upon it as not their prime objective. The bread and butter was nuclear, and this was a frill. To some people, but in fairness to all the people who worked in the renewables, the people in ETSU didn't feel like that.
And you, with a nuclear background, you became an enthusiast?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Wave power was cancelled and Salter's ducts left high and dry just at the moment when one of the wave devices was about to be chosen for full-scale sea trials. That would have cost more money. Clive Grove Palmer believes government determination to cut public spending was even more important than nuclear pressures.
It seems to me that the important thing is that it was a political decision to cut out something which was potentially a big money spender. And I think that was the decision, which was wrong, primarily because it threw away all the money that we had spent up to that point. Not only that, but it threw away all the expertise that had been developed.
What was your reaction when the decision to cancel wave energy was taken?
I resigned. I was sure it was wrong. They wanted me to wrap it up, to write the obituary, is the way I put it, and I wasn't prepared to do that.
But Peter Davies, Grove Palmer's successor, was. He denies his own pro-nuclear attitude influenced the way he dealt with wave power.
I did that job to the best of my professional integrity, and to suggest that I built in a bias because I was being paid by the Atomic Energy Authority or for whatever reason is as wide of the mark as it is insulting. The Department of Energy's aim was to find out what energy costs were likely to be from renewable sources, and WAVE was so successfully run and was such a well-organised programme that it got to its objective earlier than any of the others, and it came up with an answer which regrettably put it bottom of the league.
But wave power only looked uneconomic, says Stephen Salter, because facts and figures were distorted. Wave energy was made to seem more expensive than it really was. ETSU had hired outside consultants called RPT to calculate the likely costs of wave power electricity. Salter says that RPT's team, led by Peter Clark, sometimes made damaging mistakes in basic areas, like the underwater cables that would bring wave power electricity ashore. As the research went on, so RPT's figures on cable reliability kept changing, for the worse. In 1980, RPT said a 10-kilometre cable would fail once every 33 years. By 1982, it was 10 to 13 years, and by 1983, every single year. The more often cable failures had to be allowed for, the more expensive electricity generated by wave power would become. RPT is a large, well-established firm. It built the Thames Barrage. But how does Peter Clark explain his varying figures on cable reliability?
The figure that was used was 1 failure per 100 years. That is the figure that was used in the assessment. The figures which you're referring to exist only as either misprints or misunderstandings in a corner of the report. It may be that somebody at some stage got something wrong, but it was never brought into the assessment.
What was your reaction to the way the consultants had changed the failure rate figures for the cables that were going to bring the electricity ashore?
It's a mystery. It doesn't make sense at all. The whole point about the marine cables is it's a very well-established technology. We've been doing it since before the war. There's 80 cables in the Scottish area alone, and lots of other places in the world have got marine cables. If you can't get the numbers right on something that's so familiar as that, how can you trust the opinion of people on something that is futuristic and advanced?
To his charge that facts and figures were distorted, Salter adds the allegation that conclusions of a report favourable to the duck were simply rejected. Recognising the advanced design of the duct needed careful assessment, RPT brought in an independent consultant to keep close track of the Salter team's progress. The man RPT themselves chose to sit in judgment on the duct was Gordon Senior.
I was asked to evaluate Salter's duct in depth, with emphasis on the need to make value judgments at all stages.
How well did you get to know the duct, do you think?
Extremely well. I spent many, many meetings with Salter and with the other members of his team, John Lang, and so on. And I can't remember how many hours I spent there, but many, many hours over a period of nearly 2 years.
Do you think anybody knew the duct design outside the Salter team better than you did?
No.
Gordon Senior's report on the duct for RPT was encouraging.
More basic data from research will be needed, but no undue difficulties are anticipated.
But the report RPT now submitted to ETSU was completely different from what Gordon Senior had said to them. Now the duct was no good at all.
Even making optimistic assumptions, it was found that all the devices will break down before the end of a year's operation.
Why did Peter Clark reject the message of Gordon Senior's report?
A lot of people could see only part of what was going on. I think that's the key to it. They could only see part of the whole picture. There are a smaller number of us who'd been with it a long time, a senior core group, if you like, who really knew what was happening, who knew all the devices and could put everything in context. And we had to get the whole report self-consistent. And sometimes engineers may have made statements which just didn't tally with what was going on elsewhere in the programme, and those would be changed.
What was your reaction when you saw what Peter Clark and RPT had done with your report?
I was staggered. I was staggered because there was clearly an attempt made to conceal the fact from me. If I hadn't asked and pressed, I wouldn't even have known.
What was the effect of the final report then compared with what you put in?
I would say that it was quite different. Mine was cautiously favourable. The one that was actually put in, which is now public knowledge, was damning.
In the end, says Peter Clark of RPT, Salter's duct was sunk by the rules of engineering and the laws of physics, not conspiracy.
I disagree. It was not. It was sunk by prejudice.
64, 63.
While it's Stephen Salter who's complained most loudly about the way wave power was sunk, other scientists share some of his criticisms. At Lancaster University, Professor Michael French agrees that the way ETSU costed the wave devices was, to say the least, unfair.
Well, I don't think it was a conspiracy, but I can't be sure. I think it was a kind of bias, if you see what I mean, a pretty extreme bias in some cases.
How do you mean?
Well, the most extreme one we've had is since 1982, when they've costed scrap iron in one of our devices at something like £1,500 to £3,000 a tonne, which I think is ridiculous. Since then, incidentally, they've said they will look at it with a more reasonable costing, the same device. I mean, even if we are losing...
Professor French says the scrap iron he used in his wave device would really have cost only around £200 a tonne. It was ETSU's whole approach to costing that made both the Lancaster and Edinburgh teams feel there was a bias against wave power. In Stephen Salter's view, that was all part of a pro-nuclear pressure.
The established nuclear authorities got more and more worried that the expansion of the nuclear programme would be threatened by the potential of wave energy.
Berkeley, Britain's first commercial nuclear power station. One way to stop wave power was to say its electricity was too expensive. The other was to say nuclear power was less expensive than it really was, and that's what happened. The nuclear industry has always said it was cheap, but last year's failure to sell off atomic power stations finally revealed it's never told the truth about its real costs. The nuclear industry's had a pretty good run for our money. In 30 years, no government has called it to account. But now, as for the first time, the true costs of electricity generated by nuclear power are coming to light, so bits of the industry are turning out to be uneconomic. They're being closed down. So Berkeley is no longer generating electricity. It would be too expensive to keep it running safely. At last, the nuclear industry has been found out. It can no longer be argued that it's so much cheaper than new technologies like wave power.
Well, it's been assumed for some time, taking a price level of about today's, that nuclear power could generate at around 2.5 or 3 pence per kilowatt hour. What is now clear is that it can't possibly generate at much under 5, and maybe 6 or 7 pence per kilowatt hour is more realistic. In other words, it's probably twice as expensive as we've been officially led to believe for quite a long time.
Has the way that we've been misled in that way, purposely or not, has it mattered?
I think it's been quite important because a whole investment program, a whole commitment to nuclear technology has been based on the idea that even if you didn't like nuclear because of its environmental and other implications, you couldn't do much except accept it because it was terribly cheap.
It's estimated that closing down just the first 8 nuclear power stations will alone cost nearly £5 billion. But its champions still insist that nuclear energy is a better bet than any other technology.
Yes, the cost of nuclear energy may be slightly higher than for fossil fuels or for gas firing at this present time, but look at the environmental and security benefits which nuclear power provides to this country. We only have to look at the Iraqi crisis at the present time to see how important it is to have an indigenous energy source for our country in that sense.
And is that not the moment to look ahead for new technologies like wave energy?
I do not mention wave energy because of all the renewable energy sources. I do not believe that will be cost effective or a good investment for a utility.
That staunchly pro-nuclear attitude is shared by the man given the job of closing down the wave power programme and writing the report that justified the decision.
At the end of the day, if you really are rational about where energy is going to come from, I think you end up with the answer nuclear.
Peter Davies is understandably adamant that the final assessment of wave power he produced for the Department of Energy was not biased by his own belief in nuclear power. But he speaks revealingly about the way both he and the department treated the figures contained in his report, Wave Power's obituary.
There was no unfairness to anybody in wave energy. In fact, quite the reverse. There have been suggestions that wave energy costs were fiddled. I confess, wave energy costs were fiddled. They were actually fiddled downwards, not upwards. So we went to the Department of Energy and said, we got it wrong. The costs are way, way too low. And they said, never mind, they're still long shots, so let's not bother to get it right.
You seem to be saying that your report was pretty good nonsense, really.
No, the report, there are angles within that report which I have to concede are somewhat fictional. Now, that's not surprising. Because the one advantage the wave energy's got over all the other devices is that they've never actually built any, so we don't have any actual costs of wave energy. So you can conjecture as much as you like. There's an awful lot of conjecture in there, and therefore some of it turns out to be fiction.
So wave power was written off on the basis of figures admitted to be at least partly fictional. How different from what happens in nuclear research. They're trying for nuclear fusion.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Nuclear fusion is trying to recreate the power of the sun on Earth. No expense is being spared. If it works, fusion could generate all the electricity we need with relatively few of the nastier aspects of nuclear power. But so far, fusion is still science fiction, further from producing electricity than wave power was when it was cancelled.
No, the question we're asking of fusion is, can we get more energy out of it than we put in? And we haven't answered that yet. And even when we've done that, we've got decades, probably 60 years on official estimates, before we reach a commercial machine. Well, we would probably get there a bit quicker with waves.
If I said to you now, how much is electricity from fusion going to cost, what would you say?
I really could not answer that question. I could not begin to answer that question. The reason is that the fuel for fusion will have a very low impact on the cost. The cost for fusion power will be the capital cost of the system. And since I don't know exactly what system I'm going to build, I can't tell you now what that capital cost will be to within factors of 2 or 3, perhaps.
The costs for fusion have never been used as a yardstick by which you say whether or not you're going to go on with it. The predicted costs from fusion, even in 1982 or 83, are astronomically higher than we were getting for wave energy, but that's still going on, and spending a lot more money. In fact, one of the fusion people said to me, your trouble, Clive, is that you weren't big enough. If you'd been spending 50 million a year, they wouldn't have dared to stop you. Well, it's a point of view.
This year, nuclear research will get £100 million, wave power just 200,000. This is the only wave power device we produced, a small shoreline generator on Islay, off the west coast of Scotland. The power of the waves will push air through a turbine to generate electricity. It's been connected to the grid, but it will only ever supply small quantities of electric power. Its designer agrees it's no substitute for the large-scale offshore wave power program that was cancelled before it could prove itself.
We really need to resurrect the programme in a controlled manner, build on the prototype that we have got here, run parallel research programmes on the other offshore devices, so whenever the time comes, we can move offshore. Otherwise, if we come to an energy crisis in another 10, 15 years, we won't have developed the technology, we won't be able to change to something else.
The government still refuses to admit it was wrong to cancel the offshore wave energy programme 8 years ago and sink Salter's duck. But if Trevor Whittaker's shoreline device works well, then the pressure will be on to re-examine that decision. The Commons Energy Committee is now calling on ministers to answer what it says are extremely serious, well-documented allegations. It wants that answer fast for the benefit of us all.
We thought that the accusations were strong enough to show there was a case to answer, and we recommend that the whole of the wave energy programme be reassessed by the Department of Energy.
Why does it matter now? Why on earth does it matter to us?
Well, we're not recommending that it be reassessed to prove that somebody was wrong in 1983. We're recommending it's reassessed to give wave energy a chance in 1990.